There's nothing like diving into a brand new horror game for the first time. From the moment you enter the world of a horror game, you're greeted with multiple emotions all at once. Whether it's being excited about playing a brand new game to being terrified or anxious about the creepy building you find yourself trapped in, horror games creates an atmosphere that is completely unmatched by any other type of video game out there. With that being said, every horror game is not the same, and each one of them gives you a different and unique gameplay experience, which is why most horror games are usually split into different subgenres of horror. What's even better is that most of the greatest horror games out there usually combine multiple subgenres to create a horror masterpiece. From games that are more story oriented as they completely mess with your mind to games that allow you to be the monster that everybody's afraid of, there are so many different subgenres out there within the horror game landscape. So on this episode of Nerdspace Games, we'll be diving into each and every subgenre of horror games as I give you guys my top 10 favorite ones to experience as a major fan of horror games. Before we get started though, I actually kind of want to do something a little different for today's topic. For each subgenre on my list, I'll be giving out some examples of my favorite horror games for that specific subgenre. So what I would love to see from you guys is your own personal favorite horror game for each subgenre in the comments down below. But with that out of the way, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is the top 10 best subgenres of horror games. Let's get it. Number 10, horror visual novels.
Stop what? You mean stop the game? Hey, do you even know what you're saying?
Yeah, I know. What about it? I don't want to survive if it means I have to stoop to your level.
Oh, that's a low blow right there. Then just die in a hole for all I care! We want to live, so stop getting in our way!
One of the most underappreciated subgenres of horror are visual novels. Listen, I totally get that visual novels are not for everybody. Essentially, playing a visual novel is kind of like reading a picture book, but with more mature themes and sometimes voice acting. With that being said, visual novels are more fleshed out in terms of their story compared to most horror subgenres out there. That's mainly due to the fact that the developers are focusing primarily on one thing and one thing only, the story. In order for a visual novel to be successful, especially a horror visual novel, the story needs to be intense with a ton of dramatic sequences that help tell a captivating narrative that'll keep the players hooked from start to finish. One of the best examples I can think of are the first two games of the Zero Escape series. The narrative here is that multiple people are thrown into a game of life and death and must solve a mystery while also trying to find out who they can trust and who they can't trust. Despite being a visual novel, both games of this series actually feature multiple endings and branching narratives based on the decisions you make as the player. But in reality, the most important thing is a dark and sometimes graphic horror story that'll keep the players intrigued all the way through. Examples of some of my favorite games in this genre include the Zero Escape series, When They Cry series, Doki Doki Literature Club, and to a certain extent, Danganronpa. Number 9, interactive horror.
Christopher, you will find a lever placed directly in front of you. All you have to do is choose who you will save.
Despite being such a creative subgenre, interactive horror is probably one of the most underutilized subgenres in horror games. In fact, it seems like there's only one major developer currently cranking out horror games in this subgenre, that of course being Supermassive Games. Anyway, interactive horror games usually focus less on gameplay mechanics and primarily focus on allowing the players to make split-second decisions that ultimately creates branching narratives with multiple endings. As I said earlier, Supermassive seems to be dominating this subgenre ever since the masterpiece that was Until Dawn. Since there's little to no gameplay in interactive horror games, most of them tend to focus on character development while also creating a sense of urgency from the fact that any decision you make could kill off your favorite character in the game. Despite Supermassive being the clear frontrunner in developing interactive horror games, my personal favorite game of this subgenre is actually the Walking Dead Telltale series. I feel like this franchise has done the best job at connecting you, the player, with multiple different characters to the point where you find yourself getting emotional when you find out that a decision that you made earlier on in the game got someone killed you liked. Still, the fact that most Supermassive games feature over 100 different endings, albeit small changes in between each ending, it's hard to argue with the fact that these guys know what they are doing when it comes to interactive horror. While The Walking Dead is my favorite interactive horror game of all time, other great examples include Until Dawn and the Dark Pictures Anthology series. Hell, even the third Zero Escape game, Zero Time Dilemma, could fall into this category as well. Number 8, horror walking simulators. probably the two subgenres that get compared to each other a lot, and in most cases a lot of the same games fall into both categories, are horror walking simulators and stealth horror games. We'll talk about the latter later on, but let's first take a look at horror walking simulators. To be honest, this genre kind of gets a bad rep, as most people usually just call games within this subgenre PT clones. While PT was definitely not the first game to explore this subgenre to the fullest, it's obviously the one that kind of made it popular and put it on the map. These types of games usually focus less on gameplay and more on exploration, puzzles, and atmospheric horror, while also combining elements of jumpscare horror and psychological horror in most cases. Obviously, PT is probably the most successful and popular example of the subgenre, even though it's not exactly a full game. My personal favorites are Visage and Layers of Fear. Visage is probably the best recreation of what PT was, and it far surpasses not only PT, but every other game inspired by it that came after. As for Layers of Fear, this was the game that made Bloober Team the iconic horror development team that they are today. It's because of this game that ultimately led them to developing the Silent Hill 2 remake, which was a massive success. Both Layers of Fear and Visage are walking horror simulators with a strong focus on psychological horror and jumpscare horror. Number 7. RPG horror. Role-playing games and horror games might seem like two things that shouldn't mix, but when done right, the result is incredible. Essentially, this subgenre is a little more flexible than most of the games on today's list. What I mean by that is that different games of this subgenre explore different RPG mechanics within their horror games. My favorite example of RPG horror is of course Parasite Eve 1 and 2. Ironically though, these two examples are pretty different from each other. The first game of the series uses a mechanic that is kind of similar to traditional turn-based RPGs, but with the ability to roam around during combat and dodge attacks. You just have to wait for your meter to fill up before you can attack again. Parasite Eve 2 actually tones the RPG elements down a little so that it can focus more on the survival horror side of the game. However, even Parasite Eve 2 is a prime example of a horror RPG done right. Instead of leaning more towards turn-based RPGs, it's an action RPG, which means you can attack whenever you want. You still have access to different weapons, spells, and abilities that can be upgraded throughout the game. Other horror RPGs, like Bloodborne, focus less on horror and more on the role-playing aspect. While the world and the monsters in the game are clearly inspired by horror elements, Bloodborne is a role-playing Soulsborne game first and a horror game second. The last two examples I want to talk about are Shadow Hearts and The Evil Within 2. The latter is more of an action horror game, but has elements of RPG added in, which allows you, the player, to upgrade different abilities and skills while also exploring a semi-open world map. Shadow Hearts, on the other hand, is a full-blown turn-based horror RPG. Think Final Fantasy, but with a darker and scarier theme. Number 6. Sci-Fi horror. In space, no one can hear you scream is one of my favorite movie taglines from one of the best sci-fi horror movies ever created, Alien. Something about finding yourself trapped inside of a space station or a spaceship in the deepest and darkest parts of the universe just really creates a feeling of anxiety and unease. I feel like Dead Space Remake does the best job at capturing the true fear of sci-fi horror games that takes place in space. The idea that you're inside of a spaceship that is slowly breaking down with little to no power leaves you alone in the darkness with alien-like creatures tracking your every move is the perfect recipe for a terrifying sci-fi horror game. Prey and System Shock, while terrifying in their own right, focus a little more on action elements while still finding ways to play on the fear of being stuck in space with deadly creatures around every corner. And I really don't need to talk about Alien Isolation, do I? As it's one of the scariest sci-fi horror games ever created. And there's a good chance I'll be talking about that later on, so we'll hold off on that one. Anyways, although most of the best sci-fi horror games take place in space, there's a few good ones out there that actually take place on Earth. One of my favorites is The Thing, inspired by the John Carpenter film of the same name. The Thing pits you against an alien race that has the ability to shapeshift into your allies, which creates one of the more unique and terrifying experiences in a horror game. I will say that sci-fi horror is something that I'm hoping to see more of in the future, and with the likes of Alien Isolation 2 and System Shock 2 Remaster around the corner, something tells me that sci-fi horror is about to get much bigger and better than it's ever been. Number 5. Asymmetrical horror.
That's what you get when you play with dolls!
Most asymmetrical horror games are known as reverse horror games as well, considering a lot of them allow you to play as the killer or villain in the game that is hunting other survivors and victims. Also, another name for this subgenre is online horror, since a majority of asymmetrical horror games can be played online with other players. In my opinion, asymmetrical horror games are without a doubt the most fun subgenre of horror to play with friends. Games like Dead by Daylight and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre allows you to play either the killer hunting down the victims or the survivors trying to escape. While these types of games are clearly not that scary from the killer side of the game, as a survivor or victim, it's usually much more terrifying to go up against a human-controlled villain versus a typical AI-controlled character in other games. Because of this, they adapt to situations differently and learn your playstyles faster, which ultimately makes the entire experience much more terrifying. Despite me playing a ton of Dead by Daylight, my favorite asymmetrical horror game of all time is actually Left 4 Dead. I miss this game, and while so many have tried to capture the same vibe as the Left 4 Dead games, all of them have failed. Unlike games like Dead by Daylight, the asymmetrical aspect of the game is a versus campaign in which 2 teams of 4 get the opportunity to play as both special infected and the humans to try to score the most points throughout an entire campaign. It's a lot of fun, and it was the most addicting game I played on the Xbox 360. Number 4, Action Horror. The debate between action horror and survival horror is a tale as old as time. Ever since the release of Resident Evil 4, fans have gone back and forth about which games qualify as true survival horror and which ones qualify as action horror. The easiest way for me to describe the differences, and this is only my personal opinion, is that action horror is a more fast-paced horror game with plenty of resources available to the player. Survival horror, on the other hand, is a slower-paced horror game with limited resources and sometimes inventory management. I think that's as simple as an explanation that I can give between these two iconic horror subgenres. Anyway, taking a look at action horror, iconic games of this subgenre usually focus on hordes of enemies coming after the player all at once, in which it makes more sense to put down most of the enemies in your path. Because action horror favors combat more than most subgenres, you'll usually be able to find resources like healing items and ammo on the bodies of the enemies that you kill, as well as random breakable boxes throughout the game. Hell, usually the boss fights are littered with resources just all over the floor because these games usually focus more on long, drawn-out action fights rather than a strategic fight with limited resources. Obviously, the best example of an action horror game is Resident Evil 4 and its remake. The knife mechanics of the remake, the melee attacks, the fact that enemies drop resources, and there's a merchant where you can buy stuff, and the constant waves of enemies coming after Leon keeps things more action focused compared to other Resident Evil games like the Resident Evil original trilogy. Other examples of action horror include The Last of Us, the first Alan Wake game, and The Evil Within. Number 3, Stealth Horror.
Little pig.
Stealth horror is one of the more intense subgenres of horror, as the player usually finds themselves completely defenseless against the threats they face in terrifying situations. Stealth horror games, as the name suggests, usually focuses more on flight versus fight, in which the player must hide from enemies since they have no way of taking them down. Usually these type of games feature one or multiple stalker enemies that tracks the player throughout the entire game. For example, in Clock Tower you have Scissorsman. In games like the Outlast series and the Amnesia franchise, you have multiple enemies chasing after the player. Stealth horror does the best job at capturing the feeling that you get when you're watching one of your favorite slasher films. You know, when you are watching Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees chase after a victim, then you get a nervous feeling as the victim hides in a closet or under the bed, in which the killer comes into the room looking for them. That's the exact same feeling you get when you play a stealth horror game. My favorite stealth horror game is Alien Isolation. While most elements of this game probably fits more in line with survival horror versus stealth horror thanks to the encounters with the regular enemies and the androids throughout the game, the encounters with the Xenomorph specifically and its adaptable AI is without a doubt one of the best stealth horror experiences out there. As I said earlier, Outlast and Outlast 2 are other fantastic examples of stealth horror. The player has nothing on them except for their camera to help record the events and see in dark places. They'll need to hide under beds, behind objects, and in lockers to avoid being caught by some of the terrifying threats chasing them, like Chris Walker. Other phenomenal examples include Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Remothered, and Hunting Ground. Number 2, Psychological Horror.
I know what you are. I know why I needed you. But it's all over now. I don't need you anymore.
As I get older, psychological horror is a genre that I appreciate more and more in my horror games. While it's not the #1 subgenre of horror for me yet, it's definitely moved up on my list over the years, probably because as I got older, I started to appreciate complex stories that really made you think in a horror game. While psychological horror comes in many different forms, as it tends to combine with other subgenres to create unique experiences, the expectation is that most psychological horror games will deliver a very impactful story that will literally fuck with your mind. Hence, psychological horror. The most obvious and recent example of this, thanks to it getting a remake last October, is Silent Hill 2. Without jumping into spoilers, Silent Hill 2 focuses on multiple characters that arrive in Silent Hill who are each battling through their own personal trauma and demons, some of which manifest in some truly disturbing ways in the town of Silent Hill. Silent Hill 2 is a perfect example of a psychological horror game that combines it with elements of survival horror to give us a unique experience in that department. Mouthwashing goes a different route in which it combines psychological horror with sci-fi horror to give us its own unique experience in which the crew members of a spaceship find themselves stranded in the far reaches of space and are slowly losing their minds as resources dwindle. Other great examples include Layers of Fear, that is a psychological horror walking simulator, Doki Doki Literature Club, which is a visual novel psychological horror game, and Detention, which honestly may be one of the best psychological horror games out there in terms of the story alone. Number 1, survival horror. Ever since I played my first Resident Evil game back in 1998, I fell in love with survival horror. Because of my love for this genre, I began playing any survival horror game that I could get my hands on. Survival horror has been around for decades, even before the first Resident Evil game released in 1996. The key traits of what makes a great survival horror game are kind of in the name. Essentially, the game should be less about action and in some cases even less about the story and mostly focus on limited resources, inventory management, a terrifying setting that creates atmospheric horror, and a slower paced horror game that requires you to think each time you encounter a monster in terms if you want to kill it or save your resources and run away. In true classic survival horror, it's usually not a great idea to kill every single monster you come across due to the limited resources you have in the game. And while it's not a must, for some reason I feel like puzzles in survival horror games are a major bonus. I don't know, something about solving a puzzle in a survival horror game with the eerie music playing in the background just really hits the spot for me. Obviously, the biggest and best example of true survival horror is of course the Resident Evil franchise. While not every entry of this series is actually survival horror, the ones that are truly captures the essence of survival horror and sets the example of what a true survival horror game should be like. The best example of the series that captures this perfectly is the 2002 remake of Resident Evil. However, due to the success of Resident Evil, there have been plenty of survival horror games to come after. These games include Alan Wake 2, Dino Crisis, Tormented Souls, Fatal Frame 2, and Rule of Rose, all of which are perfect examples of true survival horror, and with a list that great, such as this one, it's kind of hard to ignore why survival horror is the best subgenre of horror games. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Do you think survival horror is the best subgenre of horror games, or do you think something else deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.